Welcome everyone to another episode of the Giant Leap podcast. I'm joined by Lethe today from Asphodel Labs. So, welcome, mate. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me on. It's nice to meet everyone.
Awesome. So,
Well, you and hypothetically your audience. It's nice
yeah,
to meet your audience.
my audience back on Earth right now. I'm the only one sort of orbiting Jupiter at the moment. What I like to start with like your gaming background in general. What games did you grow up playing, and what games do you currently play if you're still gaming at the moment?
Man, so currently playing at the moment, the main thing I play myself these days is Minecraft. I've got a really soft spot for like heavily customized and modded Minecraft servers.
Right.
I think some of the best gaming experiences I've had have been from people trying to push the kind of game mechanic boundaries in Minecraft with very heavily customized stuff. It provides a very interesting platform for people to kind of actually build mechanical systems from scratch with the engine there. The engine is so fundamentally modular that, I mean, this stuff has gone from the day people used to build adventure maps, which would essentially be games built in the mod engine. These days, people are building mod packs and stuff that provide, whole progression experiences that can last for weeks or months,
Mm,
stuff that's kind of incredible. And this is all built on top of the base game. So at the moment, like that's my fixation. Longer term, I mean, I grew up, I think the first consoles I ever had were I had the original Game Boy and I had a PS1, and I think you can roughly date me from there. The very first games I remember playing, I think, Tetris and Kirby's Dream Land. The first game I really got
classic.
attached to, I think, was Final Fantasy VII. And JRPGs in general, RPGs as a kid, I was an RPG obsessive. I got very into MMOs, more in particularly as a teenager, both kind of like modern MMOs and also most classic stuff like mods and the kind of bridge stuff like RuneScape. I guess since then, permanently retained an interest in MMOs, but I've got to be very careful because they eat up your time in a special way. And I guess I'm now kind of making MMOs, so that they're not usually compatible. I dip into EVE Online sometimes for inspiration, and yeah, otherwise, I like RPGs. I still love narrative RPGs.
Mm.
But I'm pretty careful in what I play. I've got very high standards for those. I think that for me, they've become more and more like the kind of highest end type of game, like these kind of grand narrative games. And yeah, otherwise, strategy stuff, Civilization, Endless Legend, and other similar 4Xs. I guess that's my taste.
Yeah, that's a pretty broad resume, I guess, in terms of the types of games that you played. But I can definitely see maybe a bit of a pattern in terms of what sort of uh, kind of directed you into on-chain games in particular. But just on Minecraft, yeah, I was doing. I used to play quite a bit when I was younger, especially with my cousins. We used to spend hours playing Minecraft, and hours is an understatement. It's more like months. Um, but yeah, the modding scene now, I did recently look back into it, and you're right. It's I think Minecraft is a really great example of I would say a base rule set that people have just basically taken and created their own games on top of. And I guess that has some similarities to what we're doing in the on-chain gaming space.
I mean, it absolutely does because if you look at the typical advantages of on-chain gaming, apart from the more financial stuff, composability, modding, the potential for user interaction, it kind of takes it to a new level. So yeah, I think there's a natural connection.
Absolutely, and the Lattice and Mud guys obviously did that OP craft as well, just to sort of give a demonstration of what it could look like in
Hmm.
terms of everybody working in a world together. Um, what sort of led you into on-chain gaming? For example, did you want to start building a game or games in general first, or did was the sort of attraction of being able to do it on chain now, is that what sort of pushed you into starting to do something? Because I know you were part of the Lattice, what's the proper term, like the
The
wasn't that
residency,
the
yeah.
residency, that's right, fairly early on
Hmm.
in the process. Yeah, what led you to that?
I mean, I don't want to totally dox myself, but I worked on other protocols in DeFi and throughout crypto for a while, for about 5 years before I started Asphodel Labs. And I had a lot of experiences that led me to a couple of conclusions. And one of them was that, firstly, like crypto in general has a problem with users. And this is pretty widespread. Like almost everything we hear, so many people talk about these ideas of onboarding and mass onboarding, and very few people kind of get out there and grind on actually doing this day to day. The second thing I noticed was that there was kind of this immense untapped social potential of on-chain games, because what they really do is enable new types of social interactions, new types of ownership, new types of interactions within gaming that we haven't seen before. And so I kind of joined two threads because I had seen this weakness in crypto and I had remembered, this immense social power I'd seen from MMOs. And I began to think more and more, especially when I saw certain games carry this out. I mean, there are key examples, XE, DFK, other things that started to kind of get engagement at scale. And the more I saw this, the more I became convinced getting this right would be the most important thing in the next phase of crypto. Like I love games, like I love MMOs, but for me, really, it was kind of doing the calculations on the market and thinking like, no, if this is going to change, it's going to be because of gaming. That will be what steps things up and takes us to the next level. Not because like gaming is crucial to the nature of finance itself, but because gaming is key to the nature of engagement with the blockchain in the way and at the scale we need to really change things. So I moved away from everything and I really focused on this idea of okay, so I mean, I've been an entrepreneur before. I know how to build things. I don't know how to do gaming. I do know how to build mod packs. I know how to code custom gaming stuff. I know how to run gaming communities. I've run tournaments and TTRPGs. I need to be able to cross this bridge and I need to be able to do that. I know I've done enough different industries before to know how you enter a new industry, and I know enough about gaming, but I'm not an insider. So I focused and I thought about it, and I thought, no, what I'm going to lean into is the only thing I can do confidently, which is completely and utterly on-chain gaming, because there are advantages and trade-offs to this, and it's the hardest thing for a traditional gaming studio to do is to move the entire logic on chain, to think entirely about the entire game moving through smart contracts. And if you're coming from a background of traditional Solidity and DeFi stuff, it's actually the easiest type of gaming for you to do. So I thought, no, this is what makes sense. I need to lean here and I need to build a team and a studio and put an apparatus together that can build truly and completely natively on chain games. And so we'd set out to do that.
Fantastic. And yeah, that has some parallels to actually our journey. So myself and my co-founder, we started Giant Leap from a fairly similar background because we'd spent the past few years building in DeFi in particular, and uh, we came to a similar conclusion that I guess to put it bluntly, we just didn't think there wasn't enough real value being created in DeFi. It was very circular economy stuff. We weren't able to solve problems for the real world because anytime you try to get a bit too close to those kinds of things, the regulators are looking at you very closely. And this kind of whole uh, reason behind why crypto needed to exist, became sort of a bit more vague to us until we came to the similar conclusion that, we think gaming is probably going to be one of the things that consumes more and more block space going forward. And it's one of those things because entertainment is, if you create something entertaining, then people will see the value in that, right, and pay you for that service. And that's how sustainable businesses can be built. So we had a similar thought, and also um, we're not game developers traditionally in that sense as well. We have done some, I would say, adjacent things. I used to work with a few gaming studios back in the day when I did startup incubation programs and those kinds of things. But uh, you're right in that, we thought we wanted to do something in this space because uh, it's the only thing we can and should do that would give us some kind of natural advantage over, let's say, an established game studio, which, like you said, they kind of have to readjust their entire way of thinking. Whereas for us, it's like this greenfield thing where we've got some knowledge around Solidity contracts. How can we sort of then port that knowledge over and take some of these fun game mechanics we know that we've enjoyed over the years and put them into some kind of game.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you quietly hit the nail on the head in the middle there, where you mentioned block space, because something we know because we've come from on-chain work is that filling up block space isn't a bad thing. Whereas if you say to a traditional developer, "Oh no, we filled up all the space available," they'll think, "Oh no, we need to stop this happening." Whereas in practice, if you do this on a new chain or a small chain, people are going to be excited. It gives plenty of reason for people to be interested in the chain. It generates activity. It generates user engagement. And games are kind of like, from this totally cynical bottom line perspective, they're kind of like self-perpetuating block space fillers. Like they kind of come in, and people love this. Like we don't like to admit it, but if you look at the reaction Bitcoin people, for example, had to ordinals, people are sitting there going, like, "Look, this entire block is full of these JPEGs," and they're loving it. Like people love it when we find excuses to like really heavily use a blockchain. People get excited, and so that is one of the secret advantages of on-chain gaming, because in the right way, it fills up the blocks. And maybe that sounds like a waste, but the more you learn about crypto, the more you realize people fundamentally have lots of reasons to like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've kind of known this and felt this for a while, but I think you've articulated it very well. It's um, some of the metrics that we've been happy to share is how many new wallets and how many transactions are happening on the chain that we've got the game at the moment. Whereas um, uh, a lot of the early conversations, though, around the constraints of on-chain uh, ga- uh, games, I think from maybe people that hadn't yet started to try and build something, was that, oh, it'll never work because it's going to take too much block space and it's going to be too slow
Yeah.
and cumbersome. But yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, where it's like, well, it depends on how you frame it, right? It depends on the type of game you play, and isn't the point to get more and more transactions, especially if you can derive some benefit from that. So uh, on that, and I guess diving a bit more into the architecture side of things, how are you guys thinking about, where games should be hosted? Should they be on, um, I think it's pretty clear that they're not going to work on just traditional L1s if you deploy it right there. Is it L2s for you guys, or is it sort of custom L2 app chains? What's your thinking around how that should happen?
So one thing I should underline, we stick to the EVM. Like in general, we stick to Solidity, we stick to the Ethereum virtual machine. There are a lot of options to go for if you like the EVM, but we stick to the EVM. And with that in mind, logically it's at least L2s. I think that at this clear is completely obvious. Like layer one Ethereum, no one is going to be doing a completely on-chain game on layer one Ethereum unless it has incredibly specific reasons to deal with those gas costs. Like the default now, and I think the default assumption between most people is that we're looking at this kind of nebulous space for layer two competition. I mean, obviously the classic Ethereum layer twos. Technically, I think Solana almost comes in there if you're willing to write Rust or deal with Solana. It's almost in competition with those L2s. Things like Canto, things that are in the future coming out, like Barachain, which are also EVMs, which are kind of like in the Cosmos direction. It's that kind of market segment that I think is interesting for gaming. And I mean, at that point, the L3 is just like an implementation question because it's easier and easier to spin up L3s or side chains or whatever else in a specific way on the EVM. And I think there's more and more options there without talking about specifics. So with that in mind, like my general presumption would be start on an L2. If you need an L3, it's increasingly easy to just spin one up and move to it. But you probably shouldn't move to an L3 until people are begging you to move to an L3 because you want to engage with the chain enough that when you actually move up a level, you've got the users and the engagement for that to work and for it to make sense. So I wouldn't necessarily rush into adding an extra layer, but you should be ready to do it when necessary and potentially move over. I guess that's my general thinking.
That's a good point. Uh, but there are also these new services now, I guess, that just allow you to spin up L3 so quickly. Some of them claim you can do it in 5 minutes, and you can choose which L2 or L1 to settle on and specify your token and all this kind of stuff. So I think we'll see more and more of that, and especially these kind of uh, sort of temporary chains that can be spun up for different game modes. So I find those quite interesting, and we're experimenting with one at the moment that's been working quite well. And um, but you're right. You shouldn't do it because you shouldn't sort of make things harder for yourself at the implementation stage unless you have a very good reason to do it. One one thing that I would mention that's worked for us that might be interesting to other on-chain game builders is around the onboarding, and how we do it at the moment is we spin people up uh, a wallet in the browser, and we gas it up with our own token because it's our own app chain that we've been able to create, and that allows us to very seamlessly get people playing the game right away with gassing their tokens without them having to import private keys or set up a MetaMask or even deal with MetaMask at all, as that first step into playing the game. So I think that's something potentially that L3s and your own custom gas tokens allow you to do.
Yeah, and I think what you've identified here is that there's a kind of natural marriage between these increasingly casual rollups, like this idea of rollups as a service, and account abstraction in various ways.
Mm.
So various methods of you don't want people MetaMask approving every transaction. At some point, you're going to want people to go up to a rollup. These things naturally go together. Where to some level, you account abstract as people go into the rollup. The account abstraction is tied into this, and I think solving a lot of friction is essentially about applying these two things. It's not like there's a specific playbook for this yet. We'll discover which model works, but I'm expecting that it will involve both of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all very excited about account abstraction and what allow us to do. What's your take on things like uh, well, firstly, in terms of the game designs that you guys are building and thinking of, are there, um, I mean, obviously there are lots of constraints in building on chain, but are there any sort of specific constraints with what you can sort of implement as your vision now? Do you have to work on some other things in conjunction, like ZK circuits or ticking, for example, or is the plan to create something that can work as is and then to implement those things over time?
So I'm avoiding ZK circuits at the moment. My logic and currently our company policy is that we have enough problems without introducing ZK circuits. I think we know enough people who are deep into ZK and we stay aware enough of the progress that once we have things in terms of practically launching on-chain games more sorted, it just makes sense. Like you will eventually have to use ZK mechanics. There's certain things, secrecy, like certain forms of combat, like obscuring things. I'm sure you've seen the ZK prototypes coming out recently. Some of those mechanics, like there's no way you'll be able to make like the perfect on-chain game without using ZK. It is absolutely going to come into the question,
Mm.
but I'm avoiding it at the moment just for sanity's sake. And I mean, the same applies to various other things. There's a question of whether or not you can tie in peer-to-peer stuff or similar here. But at the moment, I try to stay as much as possible within the pure on-chain gaming. And in terms of limitations, what that means really is that it's turn-based. Like your game's going to be turn-based. Like you're not going to be able to do real-time gameplay while keeping it completely on-chain right now. You can do some stuff that kind of abstracts it or gets close, but for practical gameplay purposes, I stick completely turn-based. So Asphodel, which is more of a long-term thing, is more of like a turn-based wider RPG MMO. Tamagotchi is more kind of based on a kind of the lightweight turn-based Pokemon model. But in both cases, like we're looking at turn-based RPGs. Obviously, there's other stuff you can do. You can do strategy games, you can do board game focused stuff, but it's pretty hard to get outside of that turn cycle limitation at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We get that. We started as a board game ourselves, and then we sort of tried to edge closer and closer to that real-time aspect of being a real-time strategy game. But yeah, a lot of it is kind of faking things on the UI to make it look like a more of a smoother real-time game. But you know, obviously the contracts are the contracts.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly the same principle we have. Like, we try in the front end to smooth it out. We add little elements to make things more real time. And of course, if the transaction cycle is short, then the pace is still pretty fast. But yeah,
Mm.
you are working around something that's kind of fundamental. It's fundamentally a ledger. It's always going to be turn based at the moment. At some point, it'll be fast enough that doesn't matter. But right now, it does.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, Tell me more about Tamagotchi and Kanto. I'm not too familiar with Kanto as a chain. Tell me about how that sort of came about. You know, what was the concept behind Tamagotchi as like the initial thing that you guys are building, and why Kanto?
So Tamagotchi was designed, I guess, from the perspective of us as a studio, with the awareness that someone needs to experiment, because there are very few completely and utterly on-chain games that are actually going to mainnet with some kind of token or NFT in it and actually like deploying and staying there. And as we've been working on Asphodel, which is a much larger and more long-term project, it became apparent like very, very few people have done this. We need to do this to do something larger and execute it properly. So we went, okay, what we need to slim down and we need something that's small enough that we can confidently say, okay, this is the first thing we're putting on mainnet. It's one of the first things that anyone has put on mainnet using mud, hopefully the first of this scale by the time we get it out. And okay, here is the actual experiment. Here's the test of the completely on-chain game economy. All the characters and mechanics are on-chain. Like we are actually putting this out there. We're decentralizing governance. What happens next? And Tamagotchi is really us asking that question. So obviously, like we hope people enjoy it. We'll take an interest in a bunch of different ways, but we kind of see it as a shared journey into this first deployment of like a truly early stage kind of contribution towards this autonomous world ideal. I think there's a lot of things there that are still the governance will need to be more fundamentally decentralized, the tech will need to be more composable. This is Mud 1 rather than Mud 2 at the moment. So there's lots of things there, but still, this is a clear and unambiguous step. And as I said, it's an experiment. And Canto is, I guess it could be called an experimental blockchain in terms of the infrastructure, like the thinking, the social structure, everything about Canto is experimental. And so we thought it would be the correct place to go for this project. As I mentioned earlier, like we're EVM nomads. We love the EVM in general. We look at all different cases of the EVM. And it felt like for something with this specific kind of scope and scale, Canto would be interesting. And the thing that kind of sealed it is their CSR mechanism. So they have an interesting, very lightweight way to take gas generated by the game, like a 25% share of it, I think,
Mm.
and it accrues back to the holder of an NFT, who's usually the deployer of the smart contract. So you, as an on-chain game studio, you can potentially easily accrue gas revenue from the game. I mean, in theory, it's easy to do this, but usually you have to go up a layer, right? Usually you need to deploy a layer 2 or a layer 3 in your own gas token. So using the CSR, we can stay on that bottom level token. And you remember what we discussed earlier in terms of like thinking about filling about the blocks, filling
Mm-hmm.
about the synergy of staying on the bottom level.
Yeah.
We can stay on that bottom level and we can also accrue either to us or to the DAO or to players. We can accrue some of the gas used in the game. And we thought that was really interesting because obviously this kind of long-term stuff, maybe it will come from sequence of decentralization or other schemes. Obviously in the long term, that'll be very interesting for on-chain gaming, but it's
Mm.
usually not mature. So Kanto, for something of this scope, something that's an experiment, lets us play with a lot of things in the right kind of sandbox for here and now, I guess.
Yeah, fantastic. That makes a lot of sense, and I think one of the big uh, reasons we do this, and I think one of the big opportunities is that sort of permissionless extendability, right, where people can build on top, and I think this kind of flows into that as well, where you could potentially do things like build to earn, for example, because you guys are doing that first level of building the game and earning when people transact through it, but then also other people can also participate in that journey as well. And I think there were other chains who did similar um, gas reimbursement initiatives, I guess, to sort of reward the people bringing the activity onto the chain. And I think it's a sensible way of doing things because, you know, if a product is bringing users, then you should reward them.
Yeah. And I mean, our intention specifically, the Kanto CSR thing is governed by holding the CSR NFT. And our intention is to literally just send that on to the DAO on day one and give it to the DAO and say, like, okay, here's your budget, guys. Like, because that's an extremely simple and decentralized way to do it.
Mm.
And it gives them an interest in the game that's independent of us.
Yeah, that's a great concept. In terms of the Tamagotchis themselves, are the characters NFTs or in-game assets?
So they are all NFTs. They also exist as entities within the mud world, but yes, they're all NFTs. So they are procedurally generated, unique. I think the intent at the moment, and this is not a final number, is that we'll be releasing 1,000 Tamagotchi in the first wave with some kind of ongoing minting after that. But yeah, there's a huge list of traits. They're super unique, and like any RPG character, they have their own stats. So health, stats that determine their attack and defense in the PvP mechanics, a power stat that determines how they harvest the in-game coin. We really wanted to lean into this idea here of, I mean, with our games in general, of making NFTs into characters, because we think it's a hugely underutilized concept. Like they're visually unique, you can layer them with stats. You can let people permanently on chain name them. You can add XP and progression. Like there's a ton of really just naturally fun and exciting stuff there, right? Everyone wants an NFT you can level up. I don't know why we don't have the ability to level up NFTs already. It's an inherently appealing concept.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's exactly what we're thinking as well. We've got a free mint coming up with Earn Alliance in a couple of weeks, and we have these characters called underlings, which once you connect the NFT to the game, they'll have their own procedurally generated stats that can be leveled up as well, and it'll affect what they can do in the game. And I think that's just, yeah, like you said, a very natural thing to do. And I think the reason NFTs didn't have this beforehand is because they didn't have games to plug into, right? I mean, a lot of NFT projects promised games, but obviously now that we're actually coming out with on-chain games, it's starting to become a reality.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, loot was kind of like a really beautiful, sublime idea for in-game equipment and stats that, at first, at least, had no game equip like attached. People have pretty much built out a game for loot over time from then, just because the central stack concept was so good. But
Mm.
obviously, that's not repeatable. From now on, like we need to build these things actually into games. I'm really excited to see what people do with this in general over the next few years because there's so much potential with NFTs visually, like mutability of in-game like traits. So you level up your character and the visual changes. Like obviously you're using that as your profile picture. Everyone can now see on Twitter that your profile picture has a crown on it and you've got more in-game clout. Like there's very natural, cool stuff there. And
Mm.
when you consider the ways you can link this to governance, like roles in a community in the long term, there's huge like, amounts of untapped creative potential. So yeah, very exciting space.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think one of the early debates we had inside the team initially was, should we try to work with existing collections in terms of doing stuff that would allow them to play our game because obviously they've got the advantage of existing community and distribution, or should we try to create stuff that just works more natively in our game and try to create our own community and IP? And we ultimately went with the latter for a few reasons, but um, I do think that these new generation of gaming NFTs that we'll be coming out with and other on-chain game developers will be coming out with will probably eclipse um, the original sort of blue chip quote unquote NFT collections because they'll have, actual entertainment value and utility built in. What's your take on that? Do you sort of think there's a role for these existing big collections like, the Sappy Seals or the Bored Apes or whatever to, I mean, obviously the Bored Ape guys are now more or less transitioning into a gaming company from everything that we've been able to see. But yeah, how much involvement do you think the existing collections have versus new collections that are built for games?
So I don't think many existing profile picture NFT collections will survive. Some of them will. Like no one seriously thinks CryptoPunks are going to die out. The apes will presumably stick around in some form. I don't think Milady is going to disappear anytime soon. But a lot of the others, the ones that don't have like brand or community affinity, I think those will likely disappear. Because as you say, like the whole theme of the last wave of NFTs was this crying about utility, right? And almost no one managed to deliver that utility. Some people did. And I mean, Based, who are the really like the market leaders, they are, as you say, they're chasing gaming, they're chasing this idea of metaverse utility. Like they've very consciously done that. And I think that indicates something. So yeah, I think especially because it's so increasingly easy with things like Mud to actually build NFTs into a game that you can release in a short period of time. And I think especially later this year with Mud 2 out and also with the open source tech developing, so other game projects, sample stuff, token integrations coming out, I think we'll hit a point at some point within the next year where we'll unlock kind of more distributed creativity of games because the bar at the moment is pretty high. You still need a few real engineers on your team, right? Like you can't just like ghetto program an on-chain game most of the time. You need a few genuinely skilled people.
Mm.
And we need to get to the point where like people can be freestyling game and NFT concepts, like where the technology is accessible enough that people can get very, very experimental like they do with modern indie games. And I think then we'll see very interesting stuff. Because there will be some models that will come out of that, some very experimental fringe things, presumably during the next bull run, will do incredibly well. Like bizarre stuff that none of us will predict at the moment. Because when we hit that point when creativity is more decentralized. But yeah, so that may take a year or so to kick in, but I think we're going to get there.
Yeah, I agree. There was that uh, I think very recently the Mud or Mud 2 has some integrations now with Unity or Unreal, if I remember reading that post correctly from Ludens.
I think
Um,
they're getting there. I'm not sure what the exact status. We stick to Phaser, which is the simplest engine to use for this stuff for browser games.
yeah,
I
yeah.
know Mud 2 has been progressing. I know there's talk about a project working on Godot as well.
Mm.
And I think there'll be something with Unity or similar soon. Unity would probably be the most exciting one.
Yeah, absolutely. And when that becomes fully integrated, it'll open up another set of floodgates for people looking at this space, right? I think, like you said, right now there is still a bit of a barrier for, let's say, even an indie game developer who's made a few Web 2 games and wants to experiment with Web 3, unless they're familiar with smart contracts, it's difficult for them to um, make that leap. But things like Mud and things like those integrations will just make it easier and easier.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly where that point will be where a standard indie developer will be able to come in and just make an on-chain game, but it might be sooner than we expect. And as you say, like there's a lot of secret traps. Like you don't just need to be able to have on-chain integration. You need to understand how NFTs work well enough and how people respond to them well enough to structure an NFT project. You need to understand how building things on-chain affect your game mechanics. And some of that, I think, will require the more on-chain native people prototyping it.
Hmm.
But after we cross that breakpoint, then yes. And I think then we'll start to see a migration of traditional gaming builders into Web3, but that might take years. But eventually, kind of the gates will be opened and people will logically start to move over. There's a lot of things, a lot of types of mobile games and others that frankly could just be on chain if they were implemented skillfully enough. So as that becomes easier and easier, things will start to move.
Absolutely. Um, I wanted to talk to you a bit about user acquisition for on-chain games, because at the end of the day, we all want people playing our games. What's your take on, let's say, the Web 2.5 games, right? The ones who are more like Web 2 games with NFT integrations, but they don't have to deal with any of the on-chain constraints that we have versus um, what we're doing. Do we have, do you think, a disadvantage or an advantage in terms of potentially going after the right customers versus more customers who understand the limitations or the constraints in terms of what we're building?
I think they should really be viewed as different sectors. Like we're not even in competition because the key thing is that the users we're appealing to are fundamentally different. At the moment, if you're building stuff that is, I guess when I say Web3 game, some people use the term pure play, I say completely on chain. But either way, if it's primarily a smart contract game, the only people who are going to play that right now are crypto users and a few of their friends they bring in for you. Like you're not going to recruit standard gamers to play a Web3 game. Some of these Web 2.5 games can do that. And I don't know which one it'll be. I mean, the stuff, the Squaresoft, the Final Fantasy stuff that has NFTs integrated into it, that's going to onboard some people. It won't have to be a very good game. The brand is strong enough. So that will do something. Personally speaking, I don't think we can compete with that. As I said earlier, that stuff, once it's polished, that will be more the domain of traditional game studios and much sooner than fully on chain gaming. Some of those models will presumably work. We don't know exactly which of them are good. It's kind of that's not my storyline here. I'm avoiding thinking about Web 2.5 and how to solve the problem, but someone else will solve that problem. I expect they'll probably hit mass onboarding, however you want to define that. They'll probably hit it before these true Web 3 games. I mean, there's other reasons to stick to crypto. Frankly, technically, your users are individually usually more valuable than a standard gaming user. They have a lot of affinity and long-term loyalty. So I think it's perfectly fine to stick within Web3. But the Web 2.5 stuff is going to grow in the background. That it's totally in parallel though, and I think there's no competition. A lot of the Web3 users will touch Web 2.5 stuff, if only for speculation, but most usually they won't come the other way. And if nothing else, if they do, then those Web 2.5 games will be recruiting the people who actually try the Web3 stuff. So I guess my conclusion is we really cannot do this without both sides. They're not in competition. They're kind of symbiotic. The Web 2.5 guys will recruit the only new users who will go on into these Web 3 games. The Web 3 games provide like a hardcore base of people who will supplement the Web 2.5. It very much is an ecosystem, and I think they'll grow together.
That's yeah, that's certainly a good take. So, do you think it's worth at all pursuing Web 2 gamers if we're building fully on-chain games, or is that a market that it's too far of a market for people to come in and enjoy the types of games that we'll be able to build?
My policy is not to do it. You may passively attract them if you do stuff that's really good and their friends talk about it, but deliberately trying to onboard in people who don't use crypto already is the hardest thing you can do in crypto marketing. Like my policy just in general, like even outside of gaming, is just to avoid trying to be the person onboarding new users first at all costs. It's a painful, hard job, frankly.
No, I certainly get that, especially in the DeFi days, right? It's by the time you explain to a quote unquote normie what a money market is that is fully decentralized, you might as well have onboarded 10 other crypto guys that have deposited
Exactly.
a lot more value in your protocol. Um, one idea that we've been sort of spitballing internally is, I guess, a bit of a hybrid rollout of the game, and it would require ZK circuits to sort of implement this. But we were thinking of having this kind of overworld that is fully on chain. Basically treat that game level as almost the settlement layer of the game, and then kind of like think of these little dungeons, if you will, as these sort of 2.5 faster Twitch experiences, and then using ZK to sort of settle back up to this overworld, which is a bit more of a slower moving, everything is on chain, everything is recorded type of gameplay. And we think that could be an interesting kind of hybrid model, but that runs the risk of then sort of, which community do you sort of go after? Is it these more NFT collector 2.5 people, or people that sort of appreciate the on-chainness of the game in the first instance?
Yeah, and I mean you can do something kind of similar with like temporary gasless rollups, where you're taking people into another environment with faster resolution and then bringing them back down. And to use RPGs as an analogy, you do this during combat, right?
Mm,
Like when you go into the fight screen or something, suddenly either it's gasless or your Web 2.5 or it's a ZK circuit depending on the architecture. I think a lot of games will use this specific pattern.
mm,
I've considered using instances of it. I'm not committed to any kind of individual at the moment. We won't be using it in Tamagotchi, but yeah, one of the patterns, one of these will probably be crucial. I don't personally want to do the Web 2.5 version because I think you can just do like a gasless roll up with 1 second block times, like in this kind of on principle, it's still in chain. Actually, the difference between doing that and do Web 2.5 is mostly ideology, is practically like what's the real difference at that point?
mm,
So, yeah. Clearly, like we want to go to faster execution environments at times is the point. And yes, as you say, the use of ZK in there is kind of crucial. But I don't know exactly which architecture will win that one at the moment.
mm. Yeah, that's the sort of stuff that we all kind of have to work through and figure out and see what the kind of adoption is like before we roll out these kinds of things. Um, I wanted to touch on AI because obviously you can't have a conversation these days without talking about AI. Have you guys been using it? Have you always used it? Do you think you'll use it as part of your workflow going forward? What are some interesting things in the AI world for you?
Broadly, we use it for concept art. Like that's the one thing I think at the moment is like undeniable. Like it's kind of a waste not to use AI for concept art purposes because there's so much it can do. Um, I don't use it for writing yet. I really think that, especially for creative writing and keeping tone within a game, you end up editing it so much to kind of coordinate things that it can be easier just to freestyle write. I would consider using it for documentation or longer messaging. I think it's really, I personally at the moment, I advocate for supplementing artists or writers with AI and not like entirely trying to, GPT generate the whole thing. If you give an artist AI generated concept art or inspiration or raw material and you let them edit it or coordinate it, you'll probably get something that's better and faster than you would without. So I guess I'm an advocate of AI enhanced artists, but not totally like independent AI use yet.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's and the same for devs, right? It makes our devs just way more productive. But obviously, if you ask GPT to create an on-chain game for you, then it can't quite do that right now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you don't want ChatGPT writing your code base. You want devs using ChatGPT to write their code, which they then submit into your code base, because then they're taking responsibility for it. You know what I mean? And there's
Absolutely.
still like a coherent audit process. So yeah, as you say, it's supplementing specialists with AI.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, we're using it for art and concept art as well. And I've been really curious to sort of, well, I guess depending on the types of games that you're planning to build, there's very exciting stuff around agents that can assume the role of NPCs in the world, for example, that are much richer and have better interactions, those kinds of things. So I think we'll progressively see more and more of that stuff as well.
It just seems so obvious to kind of embed basic AI into on-chain agents, right? Like there's so many easy ways to do it. You plug it into a basic language model and you give it some kind of association or tracking or some kind of information is held on-chain. There's various ways to do it. I really would like to explore doing that. I'm not doing it right now, but I think this year we would start playing with some of those toys and see what we can do. For me, the obvious interesting point here is associating some level of AI with an on-chain entity within the kind of the ECS kind of mud framework. So that's kind of giving a generic NPC of some kind, like a very basic and consistent form of AI.
Mm,
Because for me, if you just like custom coding AI or throwing it into characters to have them talk to you, it's cool, but it's not as fundamental as actually trying to embed something into characters. That there's a lot of different approaches for it. I guess it could get, I don't really want to get distracted talking super detailed about NPC AI, but I would like to try and do stuff that, especially like in regards to actual agent actions, not just language, but some very basic degree of learning in like a truly on-chain decentralized agent.
mm,
That's the most exciting part for me.
absolutely. I think that's something we're all very keen to explore. And as you say, it's such a natural fit as well for the types of games that we can build. Um, if you can tell me a bit more about the longer term vision, I know Tamagotchi is the sort of shorter proof of concept, but what are you guys thinking for the? I know it's going to be an MMO of some kind. What are some of the guiding sort of uh, points to the ideal sort of longer vision game you guys are building at Asphodel?
I mean, Asphodel really comes from the very simple insight that far too many people in crypto love RuneScape not to try and build crypto RuneScape. So it's coming from a position of specifically RuneScape, MapleStory, and the very early era mods. So kind of like pre-90s mods and very early era internet games.
Mm,
And I mean, a lot of this for us came from the question of thinking, what would an MMORPG that's crypto native right now look like? Like, kind of aiming to release something this year or next year rather than 2025, 2026.
mm,
And we came to the conclusion that we needed to go for the direction. We don't want to be World of Warcraft. We want to be Ultima Online or RuneScape. We want to be something early. We go for a more primitive and native visual style. We want to appeal to specifically purely crypto native gamers. And we want to do things that are interesting to people who are experienced in crypto. We want to build a completely on chain world that becomes kind of just the default place to stay logged in while you're doing other stuff throughout your day. And that's the ambition. And in that sense, Asphodel, I want to be the first kind of large scale, truly decentralized, immortal, autonomous world. That means building something that in 100 years' time, it's still going to be there and running. Like that lives entirely on Ethereum, where we've got all the assets decentralized. We can step away from this, eventually hash it over to DAO governance and say, okay, this world will now live on chain forever. I want to be able to say that and be able to say confidently, like this is a polished product. It's
Mm.
done. And I expect that will take us years. So that is what Asphodel is. That's why our company is called Asphodel Labs. I'm hoping that the first version of that will come out around quarter 3 this year, but that is in no way a committal release date. That's just a very rough estimate. So yeah, that's really what we're working on. Tamagotchi can be considered in some ways. It's kind of like a self-contained Asphodel demo, or at least at first it was, but it's definitely taken on its own life now and it's evolved beyond that point. But still, it came originally from that direction.
Fantastic. That certainly makes a lot of sense, and I love that concept of, it's the thing that you're logged in all the time, right? Like we used to have again RuneScape open all the time and running in the background, and we're just alt tabbing between work and going back in there when we needed to. So, and I guess that as overused as the term is, that is the metaverse, right? It's where we hang out online. It's where we choose to spend our time. It's where we have our identity. Is that kind of part of the reason that you're wanting to build this?
Yeah, I guess like I kind of refuse to call it this, but if you pin me down, it kind of is a crypto native metaverse, isn't it?
Mm.
But it's trying to actually build something that practically works as a metaverse, which I think in reality is more like a set of chat rooms with some nice characterization and mechanics attached.
Mhm.
And it's really most practical metaverses in reality have been that. And so we're trying to improve on that. We're not trying to implement like 3D VR for metaverse reality at this time. I want something that's native to crypto that feels like home for people who already spend all day on crypto Twitter. It's the metaverse for those people.
And I think that's the not only the practical way to think about it, but probably the only way that something like this would work. So yeah, I'm personally very excited to see that to get built, and I'll certainly be in there. Um, I'm just mindful of time. I've got a couple more questions. I won't keep you for too much longer, but I love this chat and picking your brain in terms of your thinking around this space. Um, the concept of bots in on-chain gaming and because there's been a lot of talk recently about uh, again I guess Web 2.5 games, which are I guess closer to Web 2 games in terms of like bots and cheating, and there was that sort of big uh, game called I think the name escapes me right now, but it's like a first-person extraction game called Dropship or Dropout or something like that. And the founder was talking about, imagine you have to go and rescue or collect a package, and you've got $100,000 worth of goods in your hands that if you lose, then you lose. And people are like, well, how do you prevent, bots from actually bots already cheat in Web 2 games where there's no financial incentive. But how are you going to sort of deal with that in if you involve NFTs with value and cryptocurrencies and those kinds of things? What's your thinking around bots? Because obviously our games are potentially designed specifically for bots to play. Um,
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. You cannot beat bots. There's two things you can't beat in Web3, and those are bots and Sybil attacks. You cannot prevent either of those things happening. You can make it hard. You can make it really, really hard, but you can't stop it. And I believe there's only one solution you can come to with a completely on-chain world. You don't stop those things. What you do is you restrict access to the world based on entities. So you remember what we talked about earlier with that idea of characters being NFTs. You cannot access the world unless you're doing so through an NFT in our games. That means that access to the world is scarce. So if a bot needs to play the world, it can buy its access token off someone else who isn't using it. And of course, that means that there are a finite number of access slots to the world. So eventually there'll be an equilibrium. There will be a point where a certain number of the NFTs are held by bots, a certain number will be held by speculators, and a certain number will be held by active players. That's inevitable. And by restricting the number of people in the game, we restrict the damage and attacks bots can do. And of course, now a Sybil attack is essentially irrelevant in this situation because by definition, if you've Sybil attacked it, all you've done is you have more NFTs than anyone else. Like that's okay. That's fair enough. That's how the game works. So we explicitly design around that from the ground up. So the point being that it doesn't matter if there are bots. It doesn't matter how many characters a person has. Each character should be a self-contained experience. It should be fun enough to play the game with a single character. And if someone wants to scale up to 200 and run them using a bot farm, then that's part of the game. This is kind of inspired by the way people approach things like EVE Online, where it's kind of just accepted at some level that like you may get swarmed by other players who have a numerical advantage, and that's part of the way the game is designed.
yeah, okay, that's fascinating. I didn't know it. I didn't know that about EVE Online. I mean, but I guess it's a similar. experience? Like as a player, your experience would be similar whether you're swarmed by bots or just, a player with 100 other ships when you've only got one.
I think the EVE Online rule, don't quote me on this because it's been a while, but I think a person can multi-box, it's like an X number of characters, so they can run 40 characters from a raft of PCs in their room. But as of when I remember, you couldn't fully bot a character. But the point is, at the end of the day, if that person with the multi-boxing, they're still attacking the game. People used to do this in World of Warcraft. There'd be a whole raid. You used to need 40 characters to kill the highest level World of Warcraft bosses. There's a very specific type of person who would simply have 40 PCs in their house.
Mm, mm.
That's always been the case. Like those kind of gaming Sybil attacks have always existed.
But as long as the in the vast minority of gamers, then I think you can sort of deal with that, right?
Well, they're always going to be in the vast minority as long as it takes skill to play the game, because you cannot play 40 characters with the same skill as one.
Mm,
So as long as there is a point where the more characters you have, the more drop off you're taking in skill efficiency, then the problem will roughly correct itself in the long term. And that ultimately, for World of Warcraft, for example, which is on a subscription-based model, that hypothetical person with 40 characters is paying 40 subscriptions, so
yeah.
that works fine for them.
Mm,
And that kind of with the nature of an NFT community, if that guy who has 40 characters is holding 40 of them, the other people holding the NFTs will probably not care very much.
mm,
That's just kind of how these things work.
yeah. Yeah. It's helping the floor price in some way.
Exactly.
Speaking of that, and I think this will be my final question to you today. The financialization of on-chain games. On the one hand, that's the inherent benefit that we inherit, I guess, in terms of building on-chain games. But there was an article put out recently by um, Bogdan from Mithraeum,
Hmm.
and he made the argument that if you don't uh, I guess, design for the hyper financialization of your game, then it will be done for you,
Yep.
and that will be a bad thing. Where do you land on this kind of discussion?
He's completely and totally right in every possible way. Like I 100% agree with him. You have to restrain the financialization yourself, or it will take control of your project. And sometimes that doesn't mean monetizing it. Sometimes it can mean explicitly saying, so we've given financial control of this project to the DAO, but you absolutely must view your on-chain game as an economy. You can't avoid doing that. You can't not put in a currency token because your players can simply launch a currency token themselves, and then all you've got is a far more unstable and potentially externally rogued currency token. You're just presenting a risk to your players to some degree. So if you're going to refuse to financialize it, you must accept that other people are going to do that for you. That may not be the wrong choice, but the financialization will happen. And if you as a team intend your game or economic stability to matter, you're going to have to really grasp that financialization and control it rather than allowing it to control the game.
Yeah, no, I would agree. There has to be some thought put into how it will, yeah, because one of the things that we thought was, let's keep the game uh, uh, currency as game balances for now because we haven't figured out all the financialization yet. But even then, things can be tokenized and markets can be created, and that's just the very nature of doing anything in crypto. So, um, at the very least, you have to map out what the economy looks like and how things will interact. Otherwise, you will lose control.
Yeah, and I mean, as you say, like even if you try to restrict things inside the game, you can't underestimate DeFi users. Someone's going to launch a perps market or something at some point. Like, there's
Exactly.
nothing you can do.
Absolutely. Um, no, look, Lethe, it's been amazing to chat. It's always good to chat with other builders in this space, but particularly liked picking your brain in terms of because you've obviously thought very deeply and about these things and come from DeFi before. But yeah, super excited about what you guys are building, especially the um, Asphodel MMO. But do you want to give the audience a bit of a plug in terms of what they can do right now for Tamagotchi, or what is it like you
Yeah.
like?
I mean, the obvious plug. I mean, I won't overdo it. Like, we will be minting them in a few weeks. You can follow the Kamagotchi Twitter account and keep an eye on that. And if you're interested in taking part in one of these early, truly on-chain mainnet gaming experiments, then please mint your NFTs. They'll be coming soon. That's the plug from us. And yeah, thank you for inviting me on. It's been lovely to chat to you, and it's been a genuinely fun conversation.
Fantastic. I'm sure we'll have further conversations in the future. I'll include a link to the Tamagotchi site as well when we publish this, and we can include the dates for the mint. But thanks again for having a chat with me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Be happy to speak again soon. See you soon. Cheers.
See you, mate. Talk soon.